Good evening. How is everyone tonight? Can everyone hear me all right? Great. How about now? Is that better? Wonderful. Thank you all for coming out to our summer spotlight lecture tonight. We're very fortunate to have Beattie and Joshua Bodwell here. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you to silence your cell phones, please, and to let you know that the restrooms are out in the hallway off to my right here. You can exit through the back of the auditorium. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Press Hotel, Coffee by Design, and our partner here, Longfellow Bookstore. Yes, wonderful. I'm just going to tell you a bit about our esteemed guest tonight. Beattie has published 21 books and has been included in 4 O. Henry Award collections, in John Updike's The Best American Short Stories of the Century, and in Jennifer Egan's The Best American Short Stories 2014. In 2000, she received the PEN/Malamud Award for Achievement in the Short Story. In 2005, she received the Ray Award for the Short Story. She was the Edgar Allan Poe Professor of Literature and Creative Writing at the University of Virginia. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She and her husband, Lincoln Perry, live in Maine and Key West, Florida. And Joshua Bodwell is the editorial director of David R. Godine Publisher, an independent Boston-based press established in 1970. In addition to the Godine book list, he also oversees the house's Black Sparrow Press imprint, a continuation of the famed West Coast avant-garde publisher's legacy. Prior to working in publishing, he served as the executive director of the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance for nearly a decade. Both Anne and Josh have been great to the library, wonderful supporters, and we're very fortunate to have them here tonight to talk about Anne's book, A Wonderful Stroke of Luck. Welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. As Sarah mentioned, it's, I have to be on this if you're going to record it, huh? Okay. Because it's not, is that good? Wow. Yowza. so Sarah just mentioned that this is Anne's 21st book. So I was thinking on the train ride up today that, if your books have reached drinking age, which is really exciting. So,
Thank you very much. Thank you. No joke.
oh, there it is, right there on the mic. Okay. So, we'll start that way, right?
You mind if I take my shoes off and get comfortable?
Ease. Truly. We haven't seen each other enough this year, so I jokingly said to you the other day that I just wanted to hang out and talk and pretend these guys aren't here. Is that okay? Is that rude? So how was the DeWitt Hardy show up at Bates?
Oh, okay. But do you know the watercolorist DeWitt Hardy? I guess it was his own meeting, but it's certainly one that he's so well known for. Well, this is so interesting. This is actually how you and I came to meet, right?
Oh, you're so good. You're jumping ahead of my notes.
Sorry,
Go
but
ahead.
When you said DeWitt, I hadn't thought about that for years.
Right, go ahead.
You know somebody for a period of time, and you think, how did we meet? No, go right ahead. You can probably make it a more interesting anecdote than I had. But my husband, being a painter, was a good friend of DeWitt Hardy's, and DeWitt, as I understand it, got in touch with my husband and said, is it okay to give this young guy who's writing a piece about some writer named, or maybe he didn't say some writer named. Anyway, he said it was Andre Dubus, the senior, and he said, "Is it okay if I, because he would like to talk to Anne?" And somehow in my mind, I just had it that it was probably a kid. I mean, that it was like a 16-year-old or something like that. I didn't know it was him, and I didn't know, how brilliant he was, and that he'd read everything Andre had ever written, and that he was writing this for poets and writers and so forth. So I kind of dashed off a response because I did know Andre toward the end of his life personally, pretty
1,000-word dash off email.
A
1,000 words.
1,000 words. Is that what it was?
Was.
Was it really 1,000 words? I do type fast. Oh, well. And subsequently, he asked me if he could run it as a sidebar, if they could run the magazine as a sidebar. And I said, if you think it's worth that, sure, that's absolutely fine. And I said, if I see that you live in Maine, you should come by if you're here, during the summer. So that's how we met.
Held it. Do you know how far back my connection with DeWitt goes?
No.
I have I call it my therapist's artwork. I have a pencil sketch of my mother nude, pregnant with me, by DeWitt.
Wow.
And DeWitt gifted this to me thinking it was a good idea.
Wow. Anyway, the show should not. The show should.
No, Anne, let's talk about that, my mom. So DeWitt has this major retrospective, if you will. DeWitt passed away, 2 years? Yeah, very recently.
Very suddenly. He was the head of the Ogunquit Artists. What do they call the bar and gallery now?
But Art Association, I think that's right. Yeah.
So yes, someone, an admirer, got this show together.
Bates. It's running at Bates. Now that we've told them all this, they have to be able
Opened
to.
only about 2 weeks ago, and it's up for quite a while. I mean, it's definitely up through August and September.
Go up to the art gallery, do yourself a favor. There's all this work that's been at Bates.
Yeah, the art gallery at Bates. It's really amazing.
And work lent out of private collections that hasn't been seen forever. Stephen and Tabitha King lent something from their personal collection. Yeah. So go see that, and you can think of Anne and I. So 21 books. I did the breakdown. 11 short story collections, 9 novels, 1 novella.
Now, the one novella was a marketing strategy. It was a long short story that was slipped out of a collection that had been bought at Scribner's, and they said that nobody had heard of me anymore. So what they needed to do was to represent me. So really, that is true, as a way to try to republicize me, to let the audience know that I was not dead. And this was like 15 years ago. 15 years ago?
That must have been a dream as a writer, first of all, just to hear that.
I was so flattered.
So flattered.
It was so good.
And
that was just so good. I felt, oh, yes, that's why I do this. But it's very odd because I still think of it as one of many stories. And certainly even
Sure.
at the time, if they were just going for length to call something a novella, they had a choice among many, many things.
And they really had their finger on the pulse that the kids love novellas.
Yes.
That's really what you hear all the time.
Yeah, and that you can put it, it's an impulse buy if you put it near the cash register, along with joke books and acrostics and all that kind of stuff. And also the cover of it, of course, it was never reissued, so if you see it at all, you'll be seeing it with the original cover, was of a young woman, you could tell from, very slight with her shoulders, from the back, with very long hair. And constantly, when I was on the road with this book, people would come up to me and say, was this you when you were young?
Another thing writers love to hear.
Really, that's a good one, yeah. And many people also said, wow, you know what this looks like? And I would say, I do, because a lot of people have told me, and then they would fill in and they'd say, an American Apparel ad. So I tell you, being a writer, you just, every day you've got reason to really feel powerful, Feel that power. Work it, work it.
So now everyone wants to know, it's Walks with Men, go out and grab it and read it. All that marketing and cover. And
worked, though. I mean, I'm still alive.
You were
you
represented.
got to give them that.
And your fan base is 25. That's very interesting. Okay, so we were talking, 21st book all the way at the end. But I was interested in starting, I don't think we've ever talked about this, about your earliest memories of writing, thinking of yourself as a writer. I'd be really interested in hearing I assume you had an early reading life that led to a writing life?
I was not a precocious reader. I meet so many writers who really were. I mean, really. I don't mean necessarily that when they were in grade school they were reading philosophy, but they were reading pretty eclectic things, even, by adult standards. And I really can't say that anything like that ever happened with me. In those days, comic books were 10 cents each or 11 for $1. And so I read a lot of comic books. It didn't hurt me. I thought about blocking. I thought about how those stories were delivered, even if they were delivered very badly. I thought, you can do that. You can just suddenly drop down a sidebar and you can see the dog looking confused, and that's in my writing. That's in every writer's writing, that kind of thing, those happy surprises or those breaking it up so it seems realistic or whatever. I don't mean that my only model is comic books, but I could think of some much better practitioners than I am too there. But I always liked stories. My parents read to me. I'm an only child. I had no appreciable talents then or now for anything else. So
That's
it's
not
great
true.
that it came down to this.
So what are your earliest memories of actually moving beyond reading comic
You mean
books to
doing
writing?
things that resemble being a writer, and you don't mean like early childhood or something
No,
like
no. At the moment where you found yourself feeling compelled to write.
that? I suppose really the only A I got in all of high school was in creative writing, and the only reason I could take creative writing was that I could switch it with my gym period. So, I had nothing, I didn't submit anything, it was public high school in Washington, D.C. I mean, it wasn't as though somebody said, oh, let's see if we can get this kid in the class or something. But, my ego was so shattered at that point. I mean, I had such lousy grades and I had nothing going on that I thought, wow, getting an A in something called creative writing that has to do with reading. I do remember, the teacher trying to find short things to read aloud and reading Lafcadio O'Hearn and even reading some poetry. And I thought, no, wait, this creative writing class said it was going to be about short stories. What's he doing reading like Robert Frost or something like that? But why not? I mean, of course, that's the approach, So that, I suppose, was very encouraging to me. But I have to say that when I was in undergraduate school, I was dating a guy who wanted to be a writer, and he insisted that I must also want to be a writer. But as we know, even 50% of all marriages across the board end in divorce. The marriage rates that end in divorce, writer and writer, very bad. So,
Higher than actor and actor.
yeah.
Only comp. It's the only comparable.
Right.
Well, you know what? I bet that's not an uncommon story. The receiving praise.
Probably not. Yeah.
We'll get to some of your other talents a little later, though. Well, your green thumb, for one, your lush gardens. So moving forward from there, then you did then become this in your own early 20s. This sort of unstoppable force. You were living out in Vermont. I mean, I've talked with Roger Angel, the former editor at the New Yorker, about this time period with
I
Anne.
spent a great deal of time in Vermont, but I was living in Connecticut.
Okay. He remembers communicating with you there.
Yeah.
Even all these years
Probably
later.
with tin cans on strings in those days.
So you had chicken soup, you had tomato. It was. I think Roger was 90 when I talked to him about this, and he was recalling these events with you from the mid-70s, early to mid-70s. So that sort of, the legendary Ann Beattie story of 1974, first New Yorker story, 4 that year, another 5 in 75, another 4 in 76, and on and on and on.
How it went, huh?
That's how it
So
went.
what's happened in the last 10 years? Can you account for this?
Well, it's gone to hell, for one. Not as bad as the New York Times book review, but,
Nothing could be.
Nothing could be. Fair enough.
But But I think it certainly worked to my advantage. Perhaps other things would have worked to my advantage too. I would have liked it if I had gotten money for a scholarship or something. If I had, been at Iowa. The Iowa writers we're talking about. I started graduate school in January of 1969. I mean, I know that's a long time ago, but there weren't writing programs the way there are now. And really, as somebody who'd written a handful of stories in undergraduate school, and remained a big reader, I didn't know. I thought maybe I could be a teacher if I studied. Maybe I could, but it wasn't at all that I had a pile of stories or that even I felt like I was on a roll then.
Roger described it was, I mean, you did have a long
17 submissions before Roger took one. Did he
Right.
say that?
Yeah. But it was in it was only a few more months than that. It was something under 2 years and 17
That's
or 18
true. I
stories
became very prolific.
that they just came and
Yes, they did come. I mean, once I turned my attention to it, it was tremendously interesting to me to try to write them. And they were much shorter, so they really could be written, at least in rough draft, very quickly. I mean, when I look back at those stories, and you probably would know this more than I, but they were somewhere hovering around 10 pages. Anything I write now, I'm not trying to have it have some particular shape, but it hovers around 20 pages. You know what I mean? So things that have a different dynamic and things that are written with different formal concerns, which now are in my mind more than they were when I was extremely young and I was just trying to tell a story sort of bluntly, as best I could. Of course.
That's what you remember from that time? You were just
Yeah.
trying to tell.
Well, that I was trying to be funny, too, that I was trying to amuse myself. They're full of things that I still find funny. On the rare occasions that I have to reread anything of mine, I often blow it. You're never supposed to laugh at your own jokes. And I have to, put my head down at the microphone and think, great, I really got even with that person, but I haven't seen that person for 40 years. Sort of.
But you never forget.
I did. I once wrote a story with spacemen who come to Earth to take pornographic pictures. And I named all the spacemen for the guys on my MA examination committee.
Was that story published?
Yes, and in fact, although he didn't know he didn't know the joke. It was such an oddball story, even when it was published. It was not in the New Yorker, but
Okay.
It was published elsewhere, and it's in my first book, Distortions, my first collection of stories. But John Updike wrote a very flattering review of me when I was young, and many wonderful things like that happened that really kind of, sank the ball in the basket. For better or for worse. And he singled that story out as, she's not often given credit for being really, out there and very, very humorous. And I thought, yes, they rejected it at the New Yorker. Maybe he liked it for that reason, too. I must say his batting average was far better than mine. And also he was John Updike. Nevertheless, are you kidding? He did get rejected at the New Yorker. Everybody does. I was in the office once when they rejected From the Estate of Samuel Beckett, a just found story by Samuel Beckett. And I was like 28. I was standing there in my sundress, It's true, really.
There was a period I feel like they would have published Updike's grocery list, though.
Yeah, I know, but and he also was a staff writer early on, so you saw his name in many genres. He was doing this, that, and everything. But I have no doubt it must be that there's nobody alive that hasn't had a rejection from the New Yorker who's a longtime writer for them. I'm sure of that.
When you said that really sunk that in the basket, were you making a Sly Rabbit reference to basketball?
Oh, yes.
So good. So good. All right, so getting on to your other talents, what have you been cooking this summer?
Vegetarian stuffed peppers. They were good. And all the herbs are from our garden. And do you know why I did that? Because the friend who was visiting loves to ask questions. And if I could just say, I don't know, it's all from my garden, that seemed it would do it. And it did do it. She looked startled. There was nowhere to go from that. I knew she wanted to ask, was even the tarragon, but she could tell from my eyes not to ask. And if I had put one thing in there that wasn't from the garden, we would have been in discussion in volley back and forth for the next hour. As I did say to her yesterday when she asked the millionth question of the day, It is finite, it is infinite, said I about questions.
Was she visiting from the city? Oh, Miami. Well, Florida. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do?
No, let Lauren Groff have them. I mean, it's fine.
Any other cooking news? I mean, talking about your other talents.
No, I've been laying off the cooking, feeling over it.
All right, back to writing. So I've read you talk about that you don't know from the outset when you start writing a piece whether it's going to be a short story or a novel. At what point do you know, and what is that moment like? What's that turning?
Well, in terms of my own writing process, and as something that I can often, point to if I'm talking about a story with somebody else who's read the same story, or back when I taught, talking to a student about their own story or something like that, it's hard to tell in advance of writing something when you're first seeing a scene, how complex that scene is going to be. I mean, just complicated in terms of how many integers are there. And to completely digress, just because I happen to be reading an essay I haven't even finished reading today, it's in the newest issue of the Swanee Review. It's by Chris Batchelder, and it's a reading that he gives of a story by Stephen Millhauser. And I haven't read the Millhauser story, but you don't need to grant his point. And what he says is probably what made me think to say that thing about you don't know how many things will drop into the story until you start writing them, because he actually pauses when he quotes directly from the Stephen Millhauser and says, oh, Millhauser's liking this. He hadn't realized himself until this point that there was also a bicycle leaning up against that wall. It's easy to see the wall, hard to see the bicycle. If you see that, you've got your detail. What about if you see a box turtle? And what if the turtle's headed toward the road, but what if you realize at the same moment that a particular kind of cloud is coming over? I mean, I know you could drive yourself mad as a writer, but actually it's a way of simplifying as a writer. In other words, it's a way of simplifying, complicating, or at least, making sure that you have a congestion of things out of which you can draw or that can explode later in the work. But until you get those visuals, who's to know how much work you have to do?
What is that moment where you have reached a point where you say, what I want to do with this can't be contained in a story? This is becoming a novel. Is there a cruise?
That's certainly a harder one for me to answer anyway, because I've so rarely fooled myself in any way. And when I did, it was so many years ago. I don't think I could stumble into that anymore at all. I think I would just be too unable to let myself go and to be that, in a way, dissociated from what I was doing in the moment of doing it, because you use language so differently. You use a lot of things so differently. But I did write a novel years ago called My Life Starring Dara Falcon. And at first, it was just going to be a short novel, whether or not it looked like an American Apparel ad. It was just going to be a very short novel, and it was going to be about the narrator. And I did that. I accomplished that, and I liked it. And I thought, and so what? It failed the so what test. Then I realized that I could just divide the book and suddenly bring forth the person who was a thorn in the side of the initial narrator. And so to me, that was more interesting because it seemed more realistic. It seemed more lifelike. I didn't like it because it was complication per se. It was just that the other one was only good writing, but this character was always unmanageable, both for the writer and for the hypothetical character, that I'd created. So, okay, bring that person in and let him shake things up. I could always have deleted it if it hadn't worked. Well, yeah, even the whole thing. I probably would have. Yeah, I probably would have deleted the whole thing, the first part. I really don't like shapely writing. Oh, yeah, I do. I deleted a whole novel before this.
What more can you say about the so what test?
Well, that it's personal, but you have to rely on yourself. And I'm even more of a reader now. And of course, I should have higher standards than I did when I was doing my best to imitate comic strips and that kind of thing, without the visuals. it doesn't matter if somebody else likes it a lot and thinks I've succeeded, but I don't think I've succeeded. I'm also in this for me. I mean, it does take a lot of effort, and I'm not going to do it just because it pleases other people.
When we should talk about Lincoln a little bit? Yeah. No, I know who he is.
Press delete or...
But Lincoln's your first reader.
Yes.
Do you have to go through the so what before Lincoln gets to read it?
Oh, absolutely.
And what happens, not that this would ever happen, but what if there was a disagreement? Not that would happen.
I've thrown things away. Certainly I have. I've thrown things away.
He approved of.
That he approved of. No, maybe I've just thought less of them. No, I'm kidding.
Of him or the stories?
I'm totally kidding. No, he's a wonderful reader. He's all too astute. No, I don't think I've ever thrown anything away that he's totally approved of. But it's interesting and very helpful to have somebody who is a good reader, who you feel is reading in terms of their knowing you, knowing your terrain. I mean, not even knowing you personally. You can know a writer by reading everything Hemingway wrote. I don't have to have met Hemingway. You know what I mean? It might have been a help. It might have been a hindrance. But in any case, it wasn't going to happen. Yeah, a hindrance. I'm with you. Yeah,
Probably.
definitely. But I mean, I think again, the test is really that if it doesn't kind of exceed your ability to paraphrase it, whether you're approving or disapproving in that paraphrase, if it can be paraphrased at all, it probably doesn't have any real kinetic energy. So I don't want that to be sent out.
Protective reader of you too, isn't he? That he has, well, he's both objective, but he has your best interests in mind.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Well, that doesn't always happen in marriages.
No.
Two
no,
writers.
No. But it's
It helps
very helpful if you do things that are understated, that it's not going to be understated to that person. You know, you're going to have your best audience, your ideal audience, and that they're going to register. That doesn't mean they're right, or they
Right.
should be right there. You've done it well enough without bringing something else in. It doesn't rule all of that other stuff out, but at least somebody's going to be reading the thing you meant to write. They're not going to think something's funny, that isn't funny or whatever. Yeah.
Funny.
I know, but I look at his face while he's reading. I sometimes take things back when he has only read 2 or 3 pages.
Really? Because he's not making the right facial expressions? Yeah. Wow. We should give him credit
Or
for...
I also say to him, when I give him a whole novel and he doesn't even know what the subject of the novel is, and I've been working on it for years, and I hand it to him and I sit as I'm looking at you now, and I sit there for a little while, and then he's read a while, and like the first paragraph or 2, and I say, what are you thinking? Or what do you think so far? I told Sonny Maida that once, who, runs Knopf. In fact, Lincoln was there when I said that. He said, you don't really. You must not do that anymore.
So we got to give... That was my Sonny Meta impersonation. Some
Cigarettes, big cigarettes.
big cigarettes. And still a bar in his office at Knopf? There used to be. Yeah, basically a...
And the cowboy boots off underneath the desk.
Yeah.
Jobs can be fun, as you know. Now,
Jobs
as you
can be
know.
fun.
Must be, huh?
Oh, I had the bar set up already, yeah. We need to give Lincoln credit for the title on the new novel, A Wonderful Stroke of Luck. And I think we need to mention that this Saturday at the George Marshall Store Gallery in York from 5 to 7, there'll be a showing of Lincoln's work. Since we're talking about visual artists.
They want to stand up now in a modest way.
In a modest way.
It's the guy laughing really nervously near the back.
5 to 7? Did I say 5 to 7? So,
Well, how do you know if you're writing a novel or a story?
well, I've never finished a novel, so.
No, but I mean, how do you know it won't come upon you? How do you know it won't come upon you when you're writing a story that you suddenly think, wait a minute.
I hope I'm not parodying Raymond Carver, but I feel like I think in short stories. And actually, that was when you were just saying during that not that you're not prolific now, but during that early rush period when you're between Connecticut and Vermont, and you were knocking out 17 stories in 20 months or something. That was that different than today? Were you seeing those, at least in some way, as full stories that you were then yeah? So that's changed. That's interesting. How has 9 novels in, how has novel writing changed for you?
I think, I don't know, because of certain common denominators, I suppose. But to me, they're extremely different. I mean, if you look at Chilly Scenes of Winter, that was my first novel, it was almost all dialogue. And I still love to write dialogue, but you have to really have the right characters to carry a lot of dialogue because you're not a playwright after all. You don't have the advantage of anyone acting and showing expression and so on and so forth, so you have to contextualize them. You have to do more of the work even, I think, than a playwright does. But that was a lot of dialogue. I can't imagine wanting to write a lot of dialogue anymore because I really don't like talk. I mean, I'm just more and more averse to it.
I know you're a fan of theater.
I'm doing my
All right,
best
that's all
tonight,
we
and I
have for
appreciate
tonight.
your being here.
No,
but
we're done.
yeah.
I'm taking your. I know you're a big fan of theater. Were you that influenced when you were writing that much dialogue back then?
I probably was influenced by it, actually. In undergraduate school, it was the theater of the absurd. That was new then, and it wasn't that I got to see a lot, but I read a lot. So I was reading whatever, Harold Pinter or Ionesco or, people who were very prolific also in those days. I was reading a lot of that. And then when I started meeting writers who weren't playwrights, when I started meeting writers at all, who was I meeting? Well, I was meeting Donald Barthelme primarily. That's really the first writer, who got in touch with me and really befriended me.
Reached out to you because of the New Yorker stories? Yeah. That's what I thought. Have you been to any good new restaurants lately?
No, I haven't eaten out much this summer. We went to Mambo the other night in Portsmouth. That was
That's always good. Was it good? Really? I aspire to get to Walker's at some point. We'll get to Walker's. We blew
have
that.
reservation. He thought I made it. I thought he made it. It happens. We ate on my back porch.
Pulled it out of the thin air. And no one asked what was in it.
I
We
bet
were
they
grateful.
Don't say a thing to her. Just let her bring something out.
Grinding herbs, leave her alone.
You're right, exactly. So you think in short stories. But even when you say that, though, and you said Raymond Carver, I can see that, having read some of your stories, certainly. But you have no particular boilerplate short story you're just thinking in terms of all your reading of all writers, like from Updike to Carver, and still saying there's something there that has just I don't mean this in the pejorative, but the weight of a story. That just has inherently, it has the shape of being an extended moment, maybe more.
Yeah, because I'm incident.
Incident.
Yeah.
Incident is a better word.
Yeah. I mean, some people are going to call Winesburg, Ohio, or Olive Kittredge novels, but they're not. They're threaded and woven together by place and character. But I tend to think I don't think about putting them together as chapters as much as distinct, separate incidents. It's my own short.
I'm one of those people who takes too many pictures, just because at some point I get nervous, I sort of freeze, and I don't know I'm not being selective enough when I'm taking a photograph. So I'll get something I didn't even know I had when I look. I mean, I'm not a professional photographer. So.
Your novels never feel like threaded together incidents. They feel novelistic.
Oh. I mean, the clunkiness being, maybe that's the wrong word too, but not a kind of negative. Well, I guess what I mean to say is I like their form to show. I like the seams to show. I like the unevenness. I like the different textures. I like even the book I was talking about before. I like to bring the bad guy forward, so to speak, and let them know in Dara Falcon.
Okay.
Just let that character who is said to be X, Y, and Z predominate, and see if the reader or even I finds that character to really be that in the moment when you're writing that. So to me, even if they might seem seamless, which I hope they do in terms of being a whole that could, contains enough to keep your attention. I certainly hope that. I'm always really happy when people talk about things that don't seem to cohere, because it's not to say that I might not have been able to write it better, but I knew perfectly well something didn't cohere. That was part of my point, but rarely do people stop to analyze that. Example being Mrs. Nixon. I mean, that is all but a bulletin board in novel form with things stuck to it that have to do with many distinct things: how one writes, how we can deal with something that seems unknowable, how the society categorizes, what kind of language, what kind of perspective the society uses for so-called famous people at the time, how these times have changed from those times, blah, blah, blah. I mean, again, that isn't to give it a check mark or a demerit, but I certainly know that's there. Had I wanted to write a streamlined book about Mrs. Nixon, I would have done so, But people are made very jumpy, which pleases me on some level, but it doesn't help my critical reception.
That's what I was going to. So that's what I was going to ask you, and that book's a good example. Is that when you do that, and the critical reception is someone not getting that, and therefore thinking that you did it and failed rather than doing it with intentionality, how is?
Well, you do have to consider what their thoughts must have been at the New York Times Book Review. I mean, they took something that was a novel that clearly has fanciful scenes in it, has imagined scenes at the end of which it says, "This is only a dream." I mean, it could hardly be more overt, but they gave it to a Republican biographer who'd never written fiction in his life. What do I think of him not liking the book?
You pleased?
Very relieved on some level. Highly relieved on some level, but in another way, it's like, wow, if you guys meant to really trip me up, you did it.
Oh, I'm sure they did. Yeah. Yeah. One of them, yeah. A recent, I had always wondered this, and I had some corroboration on this recently, where about a mutual friend of ours, where Colson Whitehead said, "I effing hate Richard Ford's writing," and they said, "Great, will you review this?" For his famous Multitude of Sins review, which is horrific. So that's what the Times does. It is what they do. Corroborated from the inside. Oh wait, we're recording this. Shit.
We'll cut that. You didn't hear that.
So I found this line about you where the reviewer was talking about that you resist traditional narrative structure. And I think maybe you've said now that you are consciously doing that. Yeah. Lincoln.
When I didn't have as many things at my fingertips when I was starting to write. I mean, for example, another early novel of mine was Falling in Place. And really what happened there is that I would write quickly, even if I was going to revise it 20 times. I was trying to get out a chapter a day, and there were 25 or so chapters. There were quite a lot of chapters. I didn't always manage that, but certainly often I did manage that, even if I had to revisit it, over and over again. I probably would have done well to have thought a little more keenly before I put anything down at all, because this was back pre-computer. This was back in the days of typewriter. But I started making notes to myself, and in those days I couldn't I couldn't italicize because it was a typewriter. All I could do was underline by striking under all the words. But that too made me spend more time with those words, because if you just press, ital and you throw it into italics, that's done in a second. You don't have any reason to reconceptualize necessarily what you've done or anything. But if you're having to go through a second time and just go to line, the way you had to hit the line for the old italics, you'll stop and think, oh, what do I need? That phrase is ridiculous, and just totally omit it and then go on. I mean, it's just that automatic editing, because you're in the moment and you're more focused on it than you would be if you were just doing it as a technicality, But anyway, some of them started to get unwieldy, and I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. I'm so exhausted, and really it's a note to myself, like, be sure to say that. And really, when I went back, I took out the be sure to say that and just put the thing I was going to be sure to say. She didn't take the train as she expected the next morning, but rather and that's what stood. So I turned the whole book in with italics at the end of all 25 chapters. And my edit, it was, I mean, this is a long time ago. And my editor called me and said, I've read it. I really like the main text, but what's all this stuff in italics? And I said, you mean the counter narrative? And he said, it's what I thought. That's what I thought. you could almost hear, you know, when with telephones as opposed to cell phones, you can almost hear the writing counter narrative.
Get that on the dust flap.
On the dust flap.
You were, I'm interested in the mechanical process. You held out for a while on the computer, didn't you? And kept with your Selectrics?
The last book of mine that came out that wasn't written on the computer, but came out in 99, so it probably was written in 97, 98, into 90.
But you couldn't compose longhand, could you? You have to
No,
to go fast.
I couldn't compose longhand. It would just disappear on me now. Absolutely. If ever I could do that. I mean, well, I think I could. When the stories were around 10 pages and that many years ago, yes. But now I guess whether I want to do it or not, I'm, you know, that critical part of my brain I'm trying to not listen to, but it's enough of a sharpened sense, and, you know, teaching adds to that, and all kinds of other things that you have to do, or if you do them, tend to have that kind of effect. So, you know, that intrudes whether you want it to or not after a certain amount of years go by. You can't just totally blunder into it. I mean, it seems like fun, but...
We should mention when you don't blunder into things, which is your writing life in the evening. You start around what time? Midnight. And on a good night, that would go till 4. On a bad night, 5. And, you know, a lot of writers like to wake up and write because they like that sort of waking.
I'm at odds with that, too. Waking up, I'm at odds with that.
No, I know waking up. But do you feel at that hour that you are able to?
I feel like a zombie, and I am.
But is that helpful? No?
I can't think.
So
I always say to people, I don't eat breakfast. That's actually because I couldn't get my head around what do I do with the fork, you know. No, I can't function in the morning.
Going back to
eggs that. Again, how do I eat them? Yeah, sorry.
Going back to that first email with DeWitt Hardy, I do remember that after DeWitt said, yeah, I can give you, here's Anne's email, and I wrote this very concise, enthusiastic email to you telling you what I was doing, and, you know, it was after my day job, so it was 6 or 7, and then sent it off thinking, well, I'm glad I did that. I'll never hear from her. But when I got up the next morning at 7 a.m., was your 1,000-word email was waiting for me.
That's amazing. Well, I'm really glad all that happened. It is very nice when somebody intervenes when they know that two people would really like to talk to each other. I don't mean in a social sense, but I mean when people really think, you know, there's one more person you might think about, or something like that. It seems to be happenstance, but I guess I'm mystical enough to think there might be something free-floating that's all to the good out there.
We are, yeah. Besides the trend. You helped me this week. I got to have that really great. You got to be my DeWitt this week.
Oh yeah.
Got to have a long conversation with Paul Auster this week, which was pretty cool.
I haven't heard about that yet.
We were chatting about how bad the New York Times book review was, and he brought it up.
Writers are not happy. This is not a good thing for our culture, really, to have simply anyone on the case. I mean, I know I can sound like an elitist snob saying that, but why would you give like the 15th novel of some writer, even if you know, why would you give that to a biographer? I mean, I'm not saying a biographer couldn't write a brilliant review, but why assume on face value unless you were sure that the person was going to be terribly insightful or empathetic or aware of what tradition, you know, the fiction writer was working in even, or anything like that. I wouldn't be able to judge the majority of biographies. Not that I never read them, but I certainly wouldn't presume to, you know, take the assignment. I just don't get it.
After Mrs. Nixon, you weren't flooded with assignments to...
I wasn't flooded with anything after Mrs. Nixon. Here we go. It's Mrs. Nixon. Here we are tonight.
This will bother you more. This was what Paul was worked up about. We were talking about Charles Reznikoff, and this goes back to when Chip McGrath was at the Times. So those were, in comparison today, better days. And McGrath called him because Oster was having a moment, and he said, we wanted something from you from the back for the back page. What do you want to write about that's exciting to you? So he said, well, I love Charles Reznikoff, and he's not read enough, and I want to write about Reznikoff. And he said, oh, okay, let me think about it. I'll call you back tomorrow. So Chip McGrath calls him back the next day. Chip McGrath, who was kind of a number 2 at the New Yorker for a long time before going on to run the New York Times Book Review, calls him back and says, I asked around with staff. No one knows who Charles Reznikoff is, so no, we don't want that essay. And Paul Auster said, that's the effing point, man. So,
Yep.
We think it's bad today. All right, I think we've arrived at the new book. Whew, we got there. So everyone got about another 2 hours?
So one of the things that I did that was really fun with the new book is that it takes place at a boarding school, and one of the teachers, who's a very snarky guy indeed, actually more insidious and a worse character than just that, has to give a talk because somebody's absent about the painting, The Peaceable Kingdom. And he really doesn't want to have this assignment, but he sort of puts himself on autopilot. And it was one of those things that as I was writing it, if I could have lifted my hands from the keyboard, I would have gone like this, because it was the prototypical, unhelpful, only talking the talk kind of talk that teachers can give to you. And some people said to me, why did you make a whole chapter of it? It's only 2.5 pages. I said, that was all I could write. That was absolutely, I just wanted him to be standing there, clearly boring the reader even more than he was boring the teenagers he was talking to, because the guy is truly unendurable. I just wanted readers to know that at the very beginning of the book. And another thing that was really fun about this book is that I named the love interest of my main character. His name is Ben, and her name is Lulu. And I give a description of, how physically beautiful Lulu is, among other things. And she has long chestnut hair and the kind of narrow eyes that slope at the corner, and so on and so forth. I gave her the first and last name of my friend Jean's dog. And it really was a good description of the dog.
So this is how you amuse yourself around 2:30 a.m.
Exactly how I amuse myself at 2:30 a.m. Yes, that's really true.
But how do you find a way into writing about a character that, would that teacher, do you despise him when you're writing about him, or do you find a way to not despise him when you're writing?
Respect a character that's more of a handful than I can deal with. Sometimes I really just have to impose my will on them because I have to. Or maybe I have to rethink the character, or maybe I have to discard the character. But I kind of, when somebody seems to be squaring off and meeting me face to face, it's an illusion of mine. This person's only a projection from my head, but I kind of think, well, go with it, at least see what happens. That's the great thing about nobody having to look at your very first rough drafts. The very first things that you put there, In fact, with some of my students would have what they thought of as writer's block, or it was a perfectly good term for it. It was writer's block to them. I would say, just put some really stupid things on a page. And they'd say, but what kind of stupid things? And I'd say, I don't know. What's the stupidest joke you know? First type that out. And then if you were going to be actually writing snail mail to your grandmother, how would you sign off? Put that, and then talk about something you've seen in advertising recently that seems either, terribly manipulative or very humorous or whatever. Like 4 or 5 little things, just put them there as though you're looking at the night sky, and you'll probably throw out all but 2 of them, but those 2, if you look at them right, will go like this for you. If they're not there at all, nothing will go like that for you. Nothing is magnetized to anything else if there's nothing to magnetize. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I want to read a humorous line, but before we go past that teacher, I couldn't help but think about what formative teachers of your own, whether in graduate school or before, as a no.
But certainly
What about
that's
Wicked
true.
Good?
Well, certainly that's true. I mean, it wouldn't even be gratifying to me to write about the abominable snowman because I know no version of the abominable snowman, you know? So you're never going to, I don't think. I mean, I did once, now that I say that, write about spacemen who come to Earth, as I said, to take pornographic pictures. So who knows? Maybe that was my subconscious talking and I'm repressing the desire to write about the abominable snowman or something like that. um, there has to be enough recognizability, but then why not just write about that person in an essay, or why write at all? Why not feel that, okay, I've known X, Y, and Z over a long period of years. I have the following thoughts about them. Might I have any more interesting thoughts, or will I ever, solve this mystery or whatever? This is talking about so-called real people, but it's interesting that that to try to make a composite of that and to draw from a lot of characters often informs me about the real life individual. That is to say, how fatiguing it is. And now that I'm an adult and I'm not in school as these people are who are subjected to him and have to be there in the class, I have more sympathy, of course, from his point of view, too. It's yet another thing in his kind of nebulous, ill-defined job, and he happens to be a narcissist, and that's wearing on people to be a narcissist. Maybe not as wearing on people who only tend that way, but full-blown narcissism is exhausting.
From the narcissist or those around them?
Narcissist.
Oh, you have compassion for the narcissist.
Well, I mean, that's the way I thought about the teacher too. In that I added that aspect of his personality that threw me off from anyone I might have been basing him on, and that seemed enough of a wrinkle to mean that I had to know a different type that I was interjecting that would be more interesting than personally analyzing any longer, somebody that I'd already come to terms with or was already clear I was not going to be able to come to terms with in life.
So we talked around the novel a little bit, but wonderful stroke of luck, this charismatic and complicated teacher. But another big piece of it is that as someone who started publishing in the New Yorker in the 70s and became, I think you'd agree, the voice of your generation. I'm sure you'd agree. Oh, no, I'm just kidding. But that was seen and has constantly been referred back to as sort of, speaking for these baby boomers, these post-Vietnam, post-hippie generation. You, in this book, have set these younger kids, these millennials who 9/11 happens while they are at prep school, just before their senior year, around their senior year. So quintessential millennials. So I'm interested in that. I mean, how did you write your way into that? How did you arrive at that?
One thing that I should have seen coming, this will really tell you, how much in the dark I was even after working on this book, is I never thought, here's what I'm up against, stereotypes of, prototypes of, particular insightfulness about millennials. I'm not saying I don't know any, but I just don't think of people in groups that way, so that when I was writing in the early 70s, I wouldn't have thought, oh, there goes another stoned hippie. I understand that it was all over my work. I understand that you can't just say that and then not have it be there when it is there. But I didn't really. The first interview I did for this book was with NPR, and it was long distance. I was down in Key West, and she was in Washington. And her first question was about millennials, and I was halfway through answering it when I really just stopped talking. I mean, of course, these are edited interviews. It wasn't live on air. I just stopped and I thought, oh man, I didn't see this coming. I hope this is not going to be people's starting point for this book. And it was their starting and ending point for the book. I really just thought, oh no, to me, this is a psychological study.
And it is, but everyone's got to put things in a box.
But as I mean, this was just my still expressing amazement. But as I said to a couple of people who were doing interviews with me, had I wanted to use the word millennial, don't you think I know it? You know what I mean? And it is fair enough that people review it in those terms, but still I would like to see it be not just that I'm faulted for not being on the ball enough or insightful enough about millennials, because that person would write it differently. Or what I don't know is, okay, I mean, I can do that about any character, including Emma Bovary, in any time period. What Flaubert might say, Madame Bovary, c'est moi, here's what he doesn't know. Here's what I would have written if I was doing that scene. But you really can't engage that as the only thing to say about Madame Bovary. You know what I mean? So again, I'm just kind of aghast at what it is that is the only thing people want. They want the surface of the drum. They want to be the one to strike it. They don't care if there's a band. They don't care if there's a melody. They don't know what music even hypothetically might be played, but they want what they want. It's easy. What should I read? I didn't think about it.
I want to read one line as you're thinking about it.
Go ahead. Why don't you read several?
No. We were touching on humor. I just had to read this line. Ben, you mentioned our hero, our lead protagonist. Ben and Jasper agreed that they could almost see her thinking, her eyes locked on the distance like someone peeing in a pool.
That's what I like. That really is part of the fun of writing, though. It goes back a little bit to what I was saying before about Milhouse's story and his seeing finally what's all this clutter in front of all he needed, which was a realistic detail, which was the wall, according to this reviewer. I'm sure that's true. A critic, I mean, I'm sure that's true. But with something like that, it was that I was seeing her. I thought, well, she's got to look some way. So what is she doing? Squinting. I mean, what might you be doing in the water because of the sun, just because of, and then I thought, oh, that seems like, you know what I mean? Things don't always click right into place, or they're too facile if they do some of the time. And while there's not really a peeing motif going on, I'm not going to argue that. Nevertheless, sometimes better things do pop in, and then you realize, my God, subconsciously, I saw this whole constellation of things that I could only have play out when I went for what I thought were random examples, random kind of markers, just to get me from one place to another. I'd have to really look at a manuscript like moment to moment to tell you that, but really I could. I mean, it wouldn't be profound to the reader, nor should it be, but I could tell you what my thought process was. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I like that with writing. I mean,
yeah. Do you ever feel the pressure about how? I mean, those lines are so such precise observations and so funny. Do you ever worry about humor? Seems so hard. It's scary.
It's so good. I need to worry. I wouldn't say so, Josh.
They expect me to be so funny because I've been so damn funny all these decades.
I'll read a little bit of
right.
LaVerdere just so you can see, what I think is.
Oh yeah. Okay, so this is our insufferable, charismatic, complicated teacher.
So, of course, he calls them only this time. I guess it'll be obvious who is being referred to, that he's talking first about another teacher and then somebody who runs the art gallery. His name is Pierre LaVerdere, and it's a completely invented name, and everybody was at wit's end with me and really wanted me to change it because I couldn't defend every choice of every made-up letter in that name. But it did embody the word dare, and that's what he's doing. He is the provocateur of provocateurs in this novel, but maybe not so much in this moment. But anyway, this is Pierre LaVerdere. Ladies and gentlemen, today Dr. Ha, though called upon, was unable to speak, so the powers that be have decreed that in the absence of the museum's art director, Ms. Alwyn Black, who is ill, I am to say something about this painting, The Peaceable Kingdom, which has newly arrived at the Harriet G. and Hubert J. Felton Gallery on permanent loan from the cousin of an alumnus. LaVerdere turned to Lulu. Miss Sills, if you could delay your boot repair until I have finished, thank you kindly. To continue, it will be obvious that a version of Eden exists before us, where animals antagonistic to one another stand contentedly side by side, a small figure assumed to be the painter, Mr. Hicks, among them. Mr. Hicks was a Quaker, as you may know from the handout photocopied by Tessie. I have read a bit about Mr. Hicks, and it seems that in spite of his projected vision of peace and happiness, which makes him a premature hippie, Aqua, you are the perfect audience. Thank you very much. He became pained at the Quaker religion as it split into factions which would be called Orthodox versus a more rural conservative faction with which Mr. Hicks, as a former farmer and sign painter, felt personally affiliated. In his old age, he came to believe that these differing views would not be reconciled. I suspect you will find out that this is a common attitude, one arrived at quite often by anyone who thinks, for example, that in our time the Arabs and the Jews must inevitably reconcile. This interjects a moment of current affairs meant to jolt you awake, since I won't assume you have freely gathered here or that you care about a depiction of lions and sheep with a conventionally beautiful sky spread overhead. Yeah, he does go on, right? Horrible.
Want to take some questions? So Rachel has the microphone. If you raise your hand, oh, sorry, I didn't give you like a. So down in front. Oh, you stand too.
Talk. What did you mean?
I think it's overvalued. I think people talk too much. They don't think enough.
And you mean it for both yourself and others? Oh, okay.
Lincoln, do you want to respond to that?
Lincoln will tell you that actually when I was teaching years ago, I did talk my head off because I had a captive audience with my undergraduates. I taught a course in literature, which I like far better than teaching creative writing personally, and because I could talk about only the stories that excited me, so I could mix and match. It was my own invented anthology in my head. The students were all honors English majors at the University of Virginia, well read, very well spoken, really good group. And I would get so excited because I had 2.5 hours to talk about fairly obscure stories with them at depth, So I talk more than I should have. Everybody will say a good teacher should ask good questions and spend a lot of time listening and so forth. But I talked and talked and talked. And my husband came in on the last day of class and he just walked through the door and he said to me, could you just go out to the corridor for a minute? And I thought, what has happened? So I went out to the corridor and he said, I'm her husband. I just want you to know you have really heard a lot this semester. She's a really good writer too. I don't know if you know that or not, but you've really heard a lot. But what I want you to know is when she walks out of this classroom, she never again says another word. Is that true? I don't talk. I realize that's kind of
Does no one else want to
conversation stopper.
Questions are thinking out loud, not talking. No other questions? All right.
Thank you.
Them.
Yeah, I scared you to death. That worked, huh?
Well, I think I want to end with someone else's smart words. Because I was thinking about all of those boxes we were talking about, whether it was voice of the baby boomers or the millennials or all of that. And I love this line from Jay Perini about you.
Oh, really?
Well, no, Jay Perini. Yeah, great. What was the name of his book on Tolstoy? The Last Station.
Made into a movie, actually. Wonderful movie with Helen Mirren. Really was good.
This is a line. This is a line from Jay about Anne, which I love. That sort of, well, he's very good at blowing those things apart. When I read her, I hear the voice. It's a wise, wry, clear-eyed, bemused, and in the best sense of that word, prophetic voice. A prophet doesn't predict the future. A prophet notices the present. In that sense, Anne is among the most prophetic of American writers.
Oh, how nice. I didn't know he said that. Huh.
You don't have to, with a quote like that, you don't have to push off the prophet sign that's been hung on you over the years.
Thank you for doing this. This is, you have to understand, he came racing back on the train from Boston tonight to do this. This is incredibly nice of Josh to do. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
What? Ann Beattie.
Okay.